Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, let's learn. Preemptive like, the original link to the video from Knowledge, top of the description. Why did the Anglo-Saxons migrate to Britain? Uh, Trade. There was war where they were from. Those are my best guesses. Let's learn, guys. Hope everyone's doing well.
Today, if something has been altered by the English language or culture, we refer to it as anglicized, a term used quite often given the vast amount of peoples that the English have anglicized to some degree or another. But when, how, and why were the English anglicized? The process of making England itself an Anglo-Saxon land and people saw it start within the mid-5th century as Rome
was falling. So the Jutes, the Saxons, and is the Angles the third one? I feel like I'm missing one. Viking stuff, and then there was a hold. I don't know. Let's find out.
Was saying its goodbyes to the British Isles, and it propped open the door for other continental Europeans to take their place. It's believed that this was the time when groups of Germanic peoples, referred to more exclusively from the 8th century on as Angles and Saxons, decided to enter the vacant landscape. There was still an indigenous population across England, namely the Britons, with the neighboring Picts and Scots from Scotland and Ireland, but the withdrawal of the Romans left a prominent hole waiting to be filled. The story of exactly how this played out, however, is a bit fuzzy. Historical sources on the matter are scant and convincingly unreliable, but a few do exist. If the Chronica Gallica of 452 is to be believed, as of 441, the British provinces had suffered various defeats and misfortunes and were reduced to Saxon rule. Others, such as a cleric by the name of Hildas, who wrote during the 6th century, talks of the Romans leaving English lands and making way for savage assailants who entered in their place with the goal of violent conquest and the utter—
Guys, so this is the age we think of as, or when people reference the Dark Ages, this is that time, right? Like 6, 7, 8, 900s. Kind of that period, as Rome is not this, well, there's the Byzantines, but is not this Europe Mediterranean spanning superpower, and now other countries are kind of getting, or other powers are getting their footing, and that's what the Dark Ages is, right?
Assailants.
And it's different from the medieval ages, which is after the Dark Ages. 1100? Am I getting this right?
Romans leaving English lands and making way
hold on. All right.
Saxon rule.
Hildas.
Others, such as a cleric by the name of Hildas, who wrote during the 6th century, talks of the Romans leaving English lands and making way for savage assailants who entered in their place with the goal of violent conquest and the utter suppression of the indigenous population. The problem here is that Hildas's De Excidio et Conquesto Britanniae is viewed as at least partially unreliable by many historians. And curiously, one of the only other detailed sources on the matter, the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written by a different cleric of the 8th century, Bede, relies heavily on the writings of Hildas for a timeline of events, but gives an entirely different perspective. According to Bede, the Anglo-Saxons, from which his own ancestors came, were not bloodthirsty conquestors, but were in fact enacting God's vengeance on the people of England. Bede tells us that these invaders came from Anglia, or possibly modern-day Angeln in the case of the Angles, Old Saxony in the case of the Saxons, and a third group, the Jutes, arriving from Jutland. He explains that these German—
And this is where the sort of Mercia, Wessex, what's the other one? Boundaries kind of come from? Because it looks like it's kind of same borders, right?
Arriving from Jutland. He explains that these Germanic peoples arrived in today's England first as explorers, then as migrants, and then as conquerors. He clarifies that any violence enacted against the Britons, as also mentioned by Hildas, was the work of God punishing the indigenous population for falling out of favor with him. This thought-provoking interpretation of what actually played out leads us to the theories that have carried over into the modern era. The predominant ideas concerning the Anglicization of England can be split into two groups, the conquest theory and the migration theory. An early belief, as seen in historical sources, was that the Anglo-Saxons entered Britain as invaders and used violence to conquer the region and force the locals to adopt their culture and language. This concept is opposed by many modern historians, however, as many points to archaeological and genealogical evidence as showing that the Anglo-Saxons arrived in England at a much slower pace, often arriving as families, and simply hoping to migrate to new lands for a new start on life. Farming may have been a significant motive for many, as floods may have been a common issue for agriculture in the migrants' homelands. Other times, the appeal of starting a new life in a new land may have been appeal enough. In this theory, regardless of what brought on the migration to begin with, historians feel that the local Britons went on to adopt Anglo-Saxon culture by choice, not by force. Another suggestion by historians today falls somewhere in between the leading theories. It posits that the Anglo-Saxons were invited onto English soil by the Britons to aid them in fighting off the neighboring Picts and Scots, and then they simply chose to stay. The evidence, as of now, might hold the key to what really happened. A recent genomic study published in Nature may have opened one of the locks keeping shut the door to the truth. The study utilized hundreds of DNA samples from English corpses dating back to the time of the proposed Anglo-Saxon invasion, and the genetics suggest that some form of migration must have occurred, as Bede and Hildas told. 3/4 of the body tested had ancestry from Northern Europe, from outside the British Isles. Furthermore, even of the bodies with mixed DNA or no
this feels all right.
foreign blood at all, many were buried in similar or identical ways to the ethnic Anglo-Saxons.
I feel like there's sort of people are trying to figure out if this is sort of a planned thing. I'm sure this is very much what happens throughout human history, anywhere on the planet. You know, calling anyone a native of anywhere is just what we call people who, at the start of known history, inhabited an area, right? It's not like anyone, you know, we all came from Africa, right? Anywhere outside of that, and most places inside of Africa, are going to be constantly revolving populations of people. And I feel like there's almost like a search for a motive in this video, where it would seem like a motive would be needed to keep something like this from happening, you know? So yeah, that's what I say. I think native, calling any place a native is just referring to the people that were there from furthest back as we know. But clearly this is what has happened throughout human history for tens or hundreds of thousands of years, as we migrated. So yeah, it makes sense. And I think it's very likely a combination of, you know, most things he's talked about.
Additionally, many of the remains buried in the cemeteries examined for the studies appeared to have had familial ties to one another. All of this genetic evidence can thus be evaluated alongside both archaeological and linguistic.
Let me say this. Imagine, you know, a group of people in a land are constantly switching and dying off and switching and migrating and fighting wars and all this, and there's this civilization in the same area, and then another one, and then a different one, and then a different one, and then suddenly someone looks at you. Well, at that moment, like this one, all right, they're looking and you're there. Well, you're the native. And so I think calling I think native is kind of it makes it seem like the population there is any different from the population that they took over from before that, and so on and so on. So this just seems like an example of what I would think would be a classic example of population migration.
Linguistic evidence. In the case of the former, Anglo-Saxon house, this genetic evidence can thus be evaluated alongside both archaeological and linguistic evidence. In the case of the former, Anglo-Saxon houses, jewelry, weapons, and burial sites have all been found, some even in close proximity to Romano-British settlements or sharing mixed burial items. As for the linguistic evidence, it's clear that over time, Old English became the predominant language, pushing aside its Latin and Celtic counterparts. After the collapse of the Roman presence in Britain, the use of British Latin was becoming less sturdy, although those who spoke Latin and British Celtic were the dominant speakers of the region still. The Germanic-speaking Anglo-Saxons would have been the minority, and yet, only a few centuries after their arrival, Old English had taken hold and was still on the steady rise, pushing Latin and the local British Celtic language to the side. A stark contrast in comparison to the way the Celtic peoples in other former Roman holdings tended to influence the Germanic migrants and their linguistics. It's clear from all the historical evidence that in some way or another, a mass migration of Anglo-Saxons into Britain occurred and greatly influenced the culture and language of the local population. The DNA, archaeology, and linguistics tell a story. But whether that story is clear or not is still up for debate. Many argue the ambiguity of it all, although one theory seems to have gained a lot of traction thanks to the ever-growing evidence. The Anglo-Saxons probably weren't armed invaders, or at least not most of them. Some discoveries, such as a handful of Anglo-Saxon bodies buried with Roman-style military necessities, suggest that at least a small portion of the migrants may have been invited in after all, to aid the Romano-Britons in their clashes with other invaders. This, however, still doesn't explain the majority of the evidence. The finding of Anglo-Saxon families buried together in cemeteries, for one matter, advocates that a large portion of the migrants came as family units to begin new lives together in Britain. The existence of many Britons buried in the same manner and with the same possessions as the Anglo-Saxons suggests that there may have, in fact, been voluntary adoption of Anglo-Saxon culture by the locals, leading to a slow shift of beliefs, traditions, and artifacts.
I feel like that, again, I'm kind of beating a dead horse here. I think that's the story of human culture and humanity, is everywhere on this planet is a blend of thousands and thousands of years of human interaction and swapping and migration and crises and wars and diseases and everything. And the weird thing would be if everyone just stayed put and stayed the same forever. That would be the strange thing. So I hope I'm not getting too off topic, but I just kind of get a feel watching this video that this is some sort of, well, it is a mystery. So I get it, though. You want to know, it still would be nice to know if there was a, just to learn about warfare and whatnot, if there was a much larger war that ended up in a much more sharp change in the way humans live, and that's important to think about. But nothing seems out of the ordinary of what I would expect with any population anywhere, not just Great Britain. So
Such a theory would
You know what I mean?
also explain why the
am I missing
Germanic
the point
language
here or
seems
something?
to have overtaken both. Would also explain why the Germanic language seems to have overtaken both pre-existing Britannic tongues. In different regions of Roman Gaul, the Germanic peoples often adopted the cultures and languages of the locals, indicating that the opposite taking place in Britain can be different regions have overtaken both pre-existing Britannic tongues. In different regions of Roman Gaul, the Germanic peoples often adopted the cultures and languages of the locals, indicating that the opposite taking place in Britain can be due to a choice by the Celtic and Latin-speaking natives to adopt the new Germanic tongue. All of this, in addition to the genetic makeup of the corpses tested, might point to a slow civilian migration process and innocent intermingling of local and foreign peoples. What it seems not to point to is the idea that a vast wave of invaders suddenly stepped ashore to spread violence and conquest across the English lands.
Which would be much more... that makes much more sense to me.
This isn't to say that Hildas and Bede were entirely wrong.
I think we like to see, or like to find, like, there has to be a cause of everything, and it's hard for us to comprehend dice just, or cards just, what's the word? Like, stuff just goes the way it goes, even if there's no intervention. You know, stuff is going to change despite anyone trying to make it change, or a large conflict changing things, I think is the point I'm trying to get across. See what you guys think about that. But yeah, obviously there are more. I think that doesn't make history any less interesting to me. It's just curious to see how things ended up, and yeah, it can be more fun maybe to learn about more sharp changes in history, but I think this is equally fascinating, just how things change no matter who's influencing what, you know.
Stepped ashore to spread violence and conquest across the English lands. This isn't to say that Hildas and Bede were entirely wrong, but it would be fair to say that they may not have been entirely right either. Thus, the answer to why the Anglo-Saxons made their way to the British Isles through Rome's open door is nuanced and partially unsolved. But in summation, the main reasons why they may have wanted to migrate to Britain might have been due to a direct invite by the Romano-Britons, or because of the great agricultural possibilities, or maybe just to start a new life. And for the reason of conquest cannot be unequivocally ruled out across the board, it's likely that a combination of multiple of these motives led to the Anglicization of England, and in turn, many other nations. After arriving, the new world of the Anglo-Saxons seemed to have flocked to their sides and mimicked their every move. It wouldn't be long before these newcomers would become the leaders of the kingdom that would make up what we know today as the English nation.
Just as these people were the newcomers to where this was, and that, you know, the people before them, I can guarantee you, had a much different culture and language than the Jutes, Anglos, and Saxons. And so I know we're just learning about the UK here, but I would be very surprised if no conquest happened. That changed it, and I'd be very surprised if all it was conquest, and I'd be very surprised if all it was families trying to find a new life. All of it being incorporated into the reason why it changed seems like the most likely answer. And there's something about history further you go back that is frustrating but also interesting, in that sources become so much more spread apart and much harder to affirm, and I'm sure it's really difficult to even get an idea of what the record-keeping traditions were at a certain time. How dedicated were people to the absolute truth? How affected were they by the influence of someone that they wanted working for, or at least wanted to give a higher praise to, and so might have left some stuff out or not recorded things or pushed some things forward. And so that can be kind of frustrating to me, just knowing that so much of this can't really be known, at least not now with the current stuff. But at the same time, the fact that it's not so sure by people, unlike how a lot of the stuff in the more recent centuries, 16th century, 17, 18, 19, obviously present day. And so there's something I love both about learning present day and more recent history, and then further history in the past into antiquity or even before that. Yeah, I like learning about both, but both can have their drawbacks. There's something not great about current history in that it's all just a sure thing, right? And so there's give and take on both sides. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm repeating myself. Love y'all. Hope y'all doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below. And hopefully we will watch another video next time. All right. Bye, guys.